Hello and welcome to the second part of my fan-made series which asks the question, what might have happened if Daenerys had survived? If you haven't already, I would highly recommend watching my previous episode for more context, but if you'd rather not, here's a quick recap. Daenerys is now queen, Jon and Tyrion have been thrown in the Black Cells, there are multiple rebellions and uprisings throughout the realm, and an army calling themselves the Winter Wolves have begun to besiege King's Landing itself, but when all hope seemed lost, the Valerian fleet has suddenly appeared. The drums grew louder as the Valerian fleet came into view, and as they grew closer, the lead ship was flying the banner of House Targaryen, signifying that they were here to help. Seeing this, the Grey Wolf decided to order a retreat. His commanders were confused as to why he would do such a thing, after all they were winning, but he reminded them that they had not yet broke through the city's defences, and they would not be able to before the Valerian reinforcements arrived, and he was not about to throw away good men in a hopeless battle. So rather reluctantly, the horn was sounded and the retreat was called. They would have their chance to fight again. As the Valerian fleet made their way into the capital, they were met by cheers and applause. Both the people and the warriors of the city cheered for the Valerians as their saviours. However, more than likely they were cheering because the Valerians had brought food which they desperately needed. Jaehaerys, Lord of House Valerian, was at the head of this procession, followed closely by his son Laenor Valerian, a young and handsome man. They arrived at the steps of the ruined Red Keep to be greeted by Daenerys and her small council, despite giving them a warm welcome and thanking them for their service. In the back of her mind, Daenerys could not help but wonder just how timely their arrival was. The Valerian fleet showed up just as the city needed them the most, a strange coincidence, but she would put her suspicions to one side. For now at least. They then bent the knee to their queen Daenerys. The warriors of House Valerian then set to work, giving out food and supplies to the citizens of the capital, while joining the garrison in its defence. Daenerys, however, was still very suspicious and wondered if the Valerians might try and turn on them, but she did receive one bit of good news. Grand Maester Samwell Tarly had toiled through the night, reading as much as he could on dragon physiology, and he, alongside a lot of help, were able to remove the bolts from Drogon, and he was pleased to report that Drogon was still very weak but in a stable condition. However, he could not say for sure if Drogon would ever fully recover. 2 days later, another bit of good news arrived in the form of Grey Worm and the Unsullied. They were exhausted after their long march, but they had made it, and Daenerys could breathe a sigh of relief at the thought of her own army garrisoning the city. As the Unsullied rested up, curiously another army appeared. This army flew the banner of House Targaryen and was made up of local lords and their levies. Apparently the lords had always intended to come to Daenerys' aid, but it had just taken them a bit too long to marshal their forces. It was fairly obvious that they were deliberately hanging back to see who came out on top, and now that that was Daenerys, they threw their full support behind her. With 3 armies at her command, Daenerys planned on using them to crush the rebellions in the west. Lady Dorna Lannister was regent of the Westerlands until her son came of age. Although she had no love for the Queen, she was not foolish enough to declare open rebellion herself, but she had no intention of stopping other lords from doing this. The rebellion in the Westerlands was spearheaded by House Banefort, a powerful and influential house. Lord Quentyn Banefort lost his sons while fighting against Daenerys. He planned on marshalling the lords of the West and then marching on the capital. However, a large contingent of Dothraki warriors had been sent to stop this. They were led by the ruthless Khal Tennek. Their first target was Deep Den, who had already declared for the rebels. The Dothraki were absolutely ruthless. They brutally sacked the castle, leaving none alive. But when they attempted to leave Deep Den, they found themselves encircled by a far larger army of rebels. In short, the besiegers had become the besieged. Deep Den was a powerful fortress, but its geography and overall layout made it very difficult to break out, especially on horseback. So until help could arrive, the Dothraki were stranded. Lord Banefort left the majority of his army there, keeping the Dothraki in check. He rode off with a couple hundred knights, determined to gather more support. While this was going on, there was a curious situation developing in the Reach. The Reach was a land of divided loyalties. Many still supported House Tyrell and remained loyal to the Queen. Lord Garland Tyrell, Hand of the Queen, sent out a call to arms to defend the throne. Answering his call, the Tyrell army reformed itself and retook Highgarden in the name of their liege lord and queen. There were 2 main forces of opposition in the Reach. House Tarly of Hornhill, led by Lady Tarly, who could not forgive the death of her husband and son, nor could she forgive Sam for siding with the Queen. Granted, she was not in possession of all the details surrounding this, but House Tarly still held influence within the Reach. The second main focus of opposition came from Old Town, where the High Septon made fiery speeches denouncing House Targaryen and Queen Daenerys as abominations. During all of this, as per usual, House Hightower was quiet. They were biding their time and waiting to see who would come out on top. Queen Daenerys ordered that Grey Worm march west with half of the Unsullied army to put down the rebellion there, and keep the other half of the Unsullied in King's Landing to defend the capital. The Crownland army was also sent to help, but in truth Daenerys still did not trust them, and the Valerian fleet would be dispatched to Old Town to deal with the High Septon and if need be House Hightower. Grey Worm and the Unsullied first marched to Deep Den, determined to relieve the Dothraki who were being besieged there. The Unsullied fell upon the rebels in the early hours, and after a brutal battle they successfully routed them, freeing the Dothraki, who then joined the army. Grey Worm then ordered that the Crownland army hold its position there. Officially it was to protect their rear, but in reality he did not trust them. Grey Worm pressed on with his army and finally caught up with the rebels on the old road, but as they began to engage the enemy they were attacked by another rebel army from their flanks. Westerland knights and Dothraki screamers clashed in the open fields, while the Unsullied formed into a shield wall to hold off the relentless onslaught of cavalry and infantry. As the battle dragged on, hour after hour, the Unsullied were losing more and more ground. With half of their army still at King's Landing, the Unsullied were heavily outnumbered, as were the Dothraki, but they also found that their light sickles, although excellent for cutting down unarmoured opponents, fared very poorly against the heavy plate armour of the Westerlands knights. As the battle continued to drag into the night, and Grey Worm's forces were continuing to lose ground, they suddenly received word that two more armies were coming from the rear. These armies were not rebel, however. The first was the Crownland army, who, after hearing of the battle, decided to march to the aid of the Unsullied. And even more strangely, the second army seemed to be an army of, well, peasants, and curiously they were being led by Sir Bronn of the Blackwater. It would appear that the Master of Coin's plan to recruit from the local population of King's Landing had worked better than anyone could have anticipated. All they had to do was promise good pay, free food, and a full pardon for any prior offences. This rather unimpressive looking army had been largely recruited from the cutthroats and murderers of Flea Bottom. They might not have been much to look at, but they knew how to fight. And as Sir Bronn said, my boys might not know how to spell honour, but they'll spill the guts of any man, be it highborn or lowborn, just as easily as your pretty boys will. Bronn's army quickly reinforced the Unsullied, while the Crownland army flanked round to the side and encircled the rebels, who were cut down mostly to a man. Any survivors scattered into the countryside. The battle, though hard won, was a victory for House Targaryen. When Lord Banefort heard of the defeat, he could not believe it. Both he and his remaining knights fled to Castle Rock to ask Lady Dorna for sanctuary. Lady Dorna Lannister graciously agreed to this, but the next morning when she looked out over her battlements she was in for a nasty surprise, in the form of a huge army. The Lannister army had been decimated by years of fighting, and the garrison of Castle Rock was less than 500 strong. They would not be able to defend against such a large host, so Lady Dorna Lannister made the decision to open the gates. She welcomed Grey Worm and Sir Bronn into her home as honoured guests. She also informed them that she had captured the traitor Lord Banefort, and she was all too happy to give him and his fellow traitors over to them, and was all too happy to reaffirm her loyalty to Queen Daenerys. With the West dealt with, they could finally set their eyes on the Reach. Jaehaerys Valerian had been dispatched by the Queen with his fleet to Old Town to remove the High Septon from power, but he was concerned. Although he swore to do this, he was not sure if he could. In typical fashion, the Hightowers had not declared for either the rebels or the Queen, and should they side with the rebels, Jaehaerys knew that the Valerian fleet would not be enough to overcome the defences of Old Town. But when he got to Dawn, he was greeted by Arya Martell, who had her own fleet and army ready to assist, as she had no interest in seeing the rebels come to power in the Reach. These reinforcements greatly uplifted Jaehaerys' spirits, so he pressed on. While this was happening, the Targaryen armies led by Grey Worm and Sir Bronn were entering from the north. Their main force of opposition came from House Tarly of Hornhill, who were rallying lords against Daenerys. Garland Tyrell, Hand of the Queen, had convinced Her Grace to let him return to the Reach to rally support against the rebels. However, when he got there, he was not impressed by what he found. The Dothraki had been raiding towns and villages, uncaring if they were rebel or loyalist. west, and likewise Sir Bron's Gutter Army as they were known were doing the same, which was driving many small folk into the arms of the rebels. Enraged by what he had seen, Garland demanded the heads of those responsible, but Daenerys refused. This act served to sour relations between the two, but Garland was a man of honour and a man of his word. He swore to serve Daenerys, and that was what he was going to do, so he rallied the Tyrell army under his banner, and successfully defeated a rebel army at the Battle of the Rose Road. Likewise in the north, Grey Worm and the Crown Land forces met with similar success, successfully capturing the rebel stronghold of Golden Grove, and with it the north of the Reach. But these early victories did not mean the campaign would be over quickly. Rebel armies continued to spring up throughout the Reach, and Sir Bron's army would be caught by one of these rebel armies at the Battle of New Barrel, where they were soundly defeated and forced to flee back to King's Landing. Fearing a prolonged campaign in his homeland, Garland changed strategy, announcing that any rebel who willingly surrendered would not only be given full amnesty and pardons, but they would also be given coin. This worked very well, and many rebels defected to the loyalists. After near a month of fighting, the last rebel stronghold of Horn Hill was finally broken. Lady Tarly, who had rallied so many lords against Daenerys in the name of her husband, was captured and sent back to King's Landing for trial. While this was happening, the combined Martell Valerian fleet, which had been joined by ships from the Arbor, made it to Old Town, where rather curiously the Hightowers were waiting for them with open arms. It would seem that the old High Septon who made fiery speeches against Daenerys had passed away peacefully in his sleep, and the new High Septon, who had been conveniently sponsored by the Hightowers, was indeed loyal to Daenerys and proclaimed her as the true queen. It was painfully obvious to all that the Hightowers, as per usual, had played both sides, declaring for neither the queen nor the rebels, and when it was obvious that Daenerys was going to come out on top, they took action to make sure that they would be in her good books. With the last rebel army on the mainland routed, all that remained was the Iron Islands. While the Queen's forces were crushing the last rebel armies on the mainland, Yara's forces were facing their own battle in the Iron Islands. The Queen had promised Yara that she would not use her own forces to retake the Iron Islands, as this would make Yara look incredibly weak to have to rely on mainlanders to fight. But as her fleet passed through the Stepstones, she did hire sellswords and pirates to bolster her forces. The Iron Islands themselves were not in a good way after Euron's death. They fell into civil war with three main factions. One faction was being led by a man who called himself the Cuttlefish, who declared a 6-year-old boy named Little Euron as Euron Greyjoy's son and heir and the true king of the Iron Islands. Coincidentally, he also gave himself the title of Regent and Lord Admiral, and united the remaining Euron loyalists under the banner of their new king. From the island of Old Wick, a drowned priest had emerged, claiming to be Lodos reborn, swearing that he would lead the Chosen to the Drowned God's court. He attracted the most fanatical of the Drowned God's followers, and the most surprising of all came from the island of Great Wick, in the form of a man who declared himself as Harren the Grey, the true king of the Isles and Rivers. Of course, the likelihood that he was actually a descendant of Harren the Black was virtually non-existent, but he was a charismatic and very strong man, who was able to gather a surprisingly large army to his side. However, it was not all bad news, as forces loyal to Yara had successfully taken Pike, giving Yara's forces a base to land on. Yara decided it would be best to destroy the Cuttlefish and his puppet king first. Her forces successfully took the islands of Harlaw and Oakmont, before moving on to try and take Black Tide, that is until she was intercepted by the Cuttlefish's fleet, smashing into her fleet, forcing Yara to retreat. As her fleet fell back, Yara's ship became separated. This was too good of a prize for the Cuttlefish to ignore. He personally led the boarding party on Yara's ship and engaged her in combat. Little did he know that he had fallen right into Yara's trap. With the Cuttlefish distracted, his fleet was leaderless and were sailing dangerously close to the nearby islands. They had sailed within range of the island's forts, which were being manned by Yara's forces, who unleashed a barrage of ballista and archer fire. Caught between the forts and Yara's fleet, the Cuttlefish's fleet was decimated. Too little too late did the Cuttlefish realize what had happened, before Yara delivered the final blow, cutting his head clean off. Little Euron was found hiding aboard the Cuttlefish's flagship. Yara's lieutenants advised that she end the boy now, so that Euron's forces would not be able to rise against her, but she didn't. Maybe the boy was Euron's son, maybe he wasn't, but the boy was innocent. Instead, she chose to make the boy an honorary member of House Greyjoy. This was actually quite a shrewd move on Yara's part, as if she had just killed the boy, she would have made him into a martyr. But in choosing to make him an honorary member member of House Greyjoy, she was not officially recognizing him as Euron's son, but it did mean that he was a member of her house. Therefore, the remaining Euron loyalists had no reason to keep fighting. A few did end up by joining Yara, but many of his surviving loyalists simply left the islands. But now she would have to deal with Lodos and Harren the Grey. After the defeat of the Cuttlefish, Yara decided to move on Old Wick and take out Lodos first, as her scouts reported that Harren the Grey did not have his own fleet. When Yara's fleet arrived at Old Wick, they quickly swept aside the small fleet that Lodos had assembled. Gaining naval superiority, Yara quickly deployed her troops on the beaches. Despite these early victories, Lodos's forces fought valiantly and progress was very slow. That is when Yara received a terrible bit of news. A large fleet was heading straight for them, the fleet of Harren the Grey. Unbeknownst to anyone, Harren had taken the ships which were still being built in the Iron Islands and hid them in secret coves, making it look like he had no fleet. That way his enemies would destroy each other so he could swoop in and finish them off. Harren personally led his army, which turned out to be far larger than anyone could have imagined. Yara made a desperate stand, but it was obvious that she was outnumbered. Realizing that neither of them could defeat Harren's army on their own, both Yara and Lodos formed an alliance. They mounted an impressive defense, holding Harren's forces back. While this was happening, more ships began to arrive at the Iron Islands. These were from the mainland. Houses from the mainland who had been watching the events unfold decided to send ships to help Yara, believing that they could use this to gain favour with the Queen. Although the fleet itself wasn't very big, it was enough to spook Harren's own fleet, who believed that these ships were the vanguard to a massive mainland fleet, so they all fled. This caused a great amount of confusion among Harren's forces, who began to rout. Seeing that the tide had turned, Yara launched a massive counterattack, pushing Harren's unorganised army back to the coast. During the retreat, Harren was knocked out, and when he awoke he was surrounded by Yara's forces, who immediately put him in irons. With their backs to the water and their leader gone, Harren's army surrendered, and thus Yara had successfully taken the Iron Islands, but it was a hollow victory for her, as prior to this she had made a deal with the Queen that Daenerys would not send her own forces to help, which would make Yara look weak. And although the mainland fleet did little to actually help, their presence alone made it look like Yara needed help to retake her homeland, so Yara would be remembered as the ruler who needed the mainland's help. And she could not help but wonder if Daenerys had sent this fleet herself. But Yara had finally achieved her goal. She was Lady of the Iron Islands, for now at least. And while these battles were occurring, House Tully, with the help of House Arryn, had successfully routed the last rebel stronghold of Harrenhal. Nearly 6 months had passed since Daenerys took the Iron Throne, and finally the realm was at peace. Now Daenerys would have to maintain that peace. But even before all of these rebellions, someone had snuck into the very heart of the Red Keep, determined to find her brother. After Jon Snow failed to assassinate his queen, he was locked away in the black cells of the Red Keep, where he would await his fate. Sansa Stark was forced to bend the knee in order to protect her brother. But Arya Stark had a different idea. Her plan was to free her brother and then assassinate the Queen. The Red Keep, alongside much of King's Landing, had largely been destroyed, so it was relatively easy to sneak in undetected. The Black Cells, however, were a bit different. They were largely intact. They were a sprawling labyrinth of dark tunnels. Even Arya found it difficult to navigate the tunnels while trying to avoid the guards. The cells themselves were largely abandoned until she came to one. She could hear rustling in this cell, and she saw what looked like a figure in the corner. She had already taken the keys from one of the guards before, so she quietly unlocked the cell door and entered, taking care to remain on guard just in case it wasn't her brother. She whispered his name softly. "Jon, Jon, is that you?" The figure came out of the shadows and into the torchlight. It was not Jon, but the new Master of Whispers, her brother, Bran Stark. Shocked by this, Arya's first reaction was to try and make up an excuse, but she quickly stopped. She knew that Bran was fully aware as to why she was here. "Where is Jon?" she said. Bran looked at her with a blank stare and simply said, "Not here." "Then, where is he?" "He is safe." "Am I to just take your word for that, Bran?" "You do not exactly have a choice in the matter, Arya." Arya was forced to relent at this fact, but she scowled at Bran. "How could you do it, Bran? How could you betray your brother, your family?" "I already told you, I'm not Bran Stark. I'm something more." "So what happens now, Master of Whispers? Are you going to have your guards seize me? Are you going to burn me as well?" "If I wanted you dead, Arya, you would not have gotten this far." "Well then, if I can't find Jon, maybe I'll pay your queen a visit." "You will not get close to the Queen. That I promise you. Then what is this, Bran? Really, what is this? You would not understand. For once in your life, will you stop speaking in riddles? All I can tell you is that these events must play out. The game must be allowed to reach its conclusion. This is the only way. But your story does not end here. This is not your fate. Then what is my destiny? Can you at least tell me that? Look to the west. Am I to abandon my family, my brother, in search of fairy tales? It is not Jon Snow's fate to die here. He will not remain a prisoner for long, that I promise you. I know this will be difficult for you to understand, as it will for many, but we stand at a crossroads. One path leads to destruction, the other to salvation. Therefore, there is no choice. There never was. You truly expect me to take your word for this? No, I know you don't believe me. And I know you will try again, but one day you will embrace who you are meant to be. And who is that? No one. Arya paused for a minute, not knowing what to say. Eventually she turned round and started to walk out of the cell before turning back to look at her brother. This isn't over, Bran. You're right. This is only the beginning.